going back hundreds of years connection to that land, and the Palestinians in general, going back thousands of years, that they cannot return to homes that they were expelled from in 1948.
You are listening to And If Love Remains.
Speak peace like a Buddhist.
A unique show spotlighting people, ideas, science, culture, and art. Your host, Mike Leavitt.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to that great podcast in the sky, And If Love Remains, and I am its messenger. Very happy to have you here, and I am very happy to have a good friend of the program, someone we've had several times, and someone who's actually become a very good friend of mine. Very happy to have Jeremy Hammond back on the show. Welcome back, brother.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to speak with you again, as always.
Yeah, we always have a good time.
Yeah, we do.
I want to talk to you. I wanted to bring you on originally, and we'll definitely talk quite a bit about it. You came out with a new ebook for people called A Brief History of Palestine, something that's quite poignant, really important for people to understand, and I think answers a lot of questions. We have these ideas of what's happening, or we think we know what the Israel-Palestine conflict is all about, or what the arguments are. But I think you put some really great points together about some of the actual history. So I want to get to that, and I'm excited to talk about that. But we had some huge news happen this last week that I was very excited to have you on and have you on the schedule already to talk about. And that was when Julian Assange was released and sent home. He's one of my great heroes. He's, I think, a hero to any real journalist out there. Tell me a little bit about, maybe your thoughts and feelings on him being released, and then maybe let's discuss just a little bit about his history, because I've actually talked to people who don't know the history and why he was, in so much peril for so long. So talk a little bit about your thoughts and feelings about his release.
Yeah, well, I think it's amazing news. I mean, it's just so great to hear finally, after all these years. I mean, it's been more than a decade of him being persecuted by the U.S. government and being in the prison in London. So on one hand, it's really incredible news to hear that he's been freed, and hopped on the plane immediately to head back home to Australia to his wife and children. So that's awesome. On the other hand, he was able to get freed by agreeing to a plea agreement whereby he will plead guilty to a single charge. So the federal prosecutors have dropped most of the charges in the indictment that they had issued against him. So he evidently has agreed to plead guilty to a single charge of conspiracy. And so the charge is that he conspired with Chelsea Manning, the private first class at the time, who was formerly known as Bradley Manning, who had leaked. She was an intelligence analyst, and she had leaked, classified documents to WikiLeaks. So Julian Assange, for people who don't know, is the founder of the WikiLeaks organization. And so they were going after him for that. Going back to the history, essentially what Assange was doing was journalism. And it's really no different than when the Pentagon Papers were leaked to the New York Times. The New York Times published the Pentagon Papers, and that helped bring about the change of public opinion that led to the end of the Vietnam War, which was a criminal war of aggression against mainly South Vietnam. And so that's journalism, right?
Right.
And so they're prosecuting him for doing journalism. And so it is upsetting and disturbing to see the U.S. government literally criminalizing journalism. And
Right.
so that's kind of the negative aspect of this. of course, you can't blame Assange for
No
accepting that
way.
plea agreement. I
Well,
mean, he had to get out of there. He needed to be freed, and so just nothing but respect and admiration for his exposure of, and this is the real problem, was that he was exposing the U.S. government's criminal policies and actions. Example being the publication of a video taken in 2007 in Iraq of an Apache helicopter gunship mowing down civilians, including two Reuters journalists. Releasing documents related to the Afghan war, the Iraq war, showing that the U.S. government was lying about the civilian casualty counts. Later on, publishing leaked embassy cables, many, including a number that I had cited in my book, Obstacle to Peace. For example, one of the cables was a discussion from the U.S. Embassy in Israel discussing the Israel policy of the blockade in Gaza, and explaining how the Israeli government had been very candid in their purpose for that, which was to keep the Gazan economy on the brink of a humanitarian crisis without quite letting it go over the edge. So in other words, the explicitly stated purpose is to collectively punish the civilian population of Gaza. So that's right there, acknowledged by the U.S. State Department in these cables. That's just one example. And so this is why he was being targeted by the U.S. government and being persecuted by the U.S. government, because he was exposing U.S. government's criminal actions and policies. And of course, the U.S. government, in the case of Gaza, supports Israel's policy of blockading Gaza and collectively punishing the civilian population there, including now supporting Israel's genocide in Gaza. So that's why he was a target. And so the U.S. government has criminalized the practice of journalism, which is, of course, very disturbing. But again, I'm just so glad that he's free.
Absolutely. 100% agree with that assessment. I think, one thing, and I'll say this from the start. I think, he made such a heroic effort in exposing what you talked about, exposing the regime and those bloodthirsty monsters for who they were, and really exposing America to what they were supporting, what they thought that they were supporting was not what they were supporting, and the absolute horrendous deeds that are unfortunate and poor soldiers were doing to these people. It's terrible. So that was such a heroic thing that he was doing, and I'm so happy he's home. And because there is that charge, I think in some ways it gives journalists an opportunity, journalists like you and others who are independent and free thinking, to take up that same mantle and explain and expose, and maybe why that charge itself is 100% illegitimate. I mean, I think there's so much it's everything about his case is so ironic and insane. We talk about Julian Assange, and a lot of people don't realize, like, he is not a U.S. citizen. He is not subject to U.S. law. Let's start right there. I mean, he's not subject to. There was no reason for the U.S. legally to go after him for what he did, and they had no jurisdiction over him. It really is a case of, we're just going to persecute and go after this man and absolutely destroy him. And I think, like I said, I think it's an opportunity for journalists to again expose the regime for what it is in this matter as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Just how there's this illusion of a free press.
Right.
Right. And it wasn't just foreign policy stuff that he was exposing, like also with the DNC, the Democratic National Committee.
Absolutely.
In 2016, what they claimed was a Russian hack of the DNC computers and emails, including Hillary Clinton's emails. but which, according to WikiLeaks, which published the materials, was not a hack; it was a leak.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, that was central to the whole RussiaGate hoax. This claim that Trump was colluding with Putin to steal the election and all that
Right.
nonsense. So this tied right into that whole narrative because one of the things that the leaked documents, hacked, what the document showed, one of the things was how the Democratic Party was conspiring within the party to sideline Bernie Sanders because
Right.
they had already predetermined that Hillary Clinton was going to be their candidate. And so in the primaries, they were trying to sideline Bernie Sanders. And it was this conspiracy to do that, which, really revealed how undemocratic the process and the system is. And so
Which, by the way,
they had to try to change the narrative. And so to shift
yeah,
the
yeah,
public discourse away from this focus on how undemocratic the process is, that's why they came up with the whole Russiagate hoax to begin with. It was to deflect attention from that central theme. And so, which they did successfully do, they
and,
managed to just completely shift the public discourse away from that and onto
right.
Donald Trump.
Well, and if you think like the process has changed it all. Yes, it exposed it, but I mean, could you imagine getting the leaked emails from the Democrats? After last night's debate, for example, how what is going on to replace Biden, or what is going on. I just can imagine like getting some leaked emails and then how are we going to deflect that and blame it on Trump and all of these things, because it's the same. And by the way, it's not just the Democrats. I mean, Republicans do the same thing. We could talk about the Ron Paul candidacies and how
Yep.
they were completely sabotaged by the Republicans. So the regime, the people who the elites do not want independent, do not want populist people to be in their government. They want people that they can control, and that's just been the
They want you
case.
to vote for this head of the beast or this head of the beast. But
Exactly.
both of those heads are connected to the same body.
That's right.
They're just they're two
And another
sides
thing
to
that
the
was
same coin.
Yeah, and another thing that was leaked, I was just thinking about that really had, I think, a bigger impact culturally than uh, today, is the leak about the uh, about the how we are completely spying on our own people, and how the U.S. government is not using these terrorist finding tactics just to go find Muslim brown people in foreign lands who want to blow up buildings and airplanes. They're actually looking and scouring every single communication that we have, and they will have and do use it against us.
Yeah, we are the targets,
Exactly.
not terrorists. Us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. So again, man, I appreciate your take. I think again, Julian Assange, really happy he's home with his family, and it's now time for somebody else to take on that torch, and for more than one people, because I think that's the problem. Is it really was one person doing real journalism. It was one person, and in a sea of just corrupt cronyism, that was a voice, and we need multiple channels, multiple people stepping up and being doing their job as far as like pushing against the agenda of the people that yeah, that target us, as you say. So
Yeah, I mean, we're targeted. Their surveillance, but also just we're targeted with essentially mind control
mm-hmm.
propaganda. The purpose is to control our minds, control the way we think, and being an election season, um, it's kind of important to make the point about again and the lack of democracy and the undemocratic processes. And people like to think that there's a free press. People like to think that this is a free country. but you're not free if your mind is being controlled.
Right.
And that's really what I aim to do with my work, is to free people's minds from mental slavery, so that they can see the real world around them, because people are really deluded into believing, fictional narratives and outright falsehoods. So people have this like worldview that is outright delusional. And I want to try to help do what I can to help free minds and get people to see what's really happening. And and what really shocks me is how, in this day and age, when we have the internet at our fingertips, how so many Americans are still just trapped in this mindset of viewing everything through this lens, of this narrow political spectrum of left versus right, and liberal
Right.
versus conservative, and Democrat versus Republican. And if you can't even escape that, narrow framework of thinking, that shouldn't be too challenging. And yet still, I think that's how most Americans view anything political, is through
Right.
that narrow linear spectrum.
Well,
And it's just, like my point of view is completely off that linear chart. It doesn't fall
right.
anywhere along that narrow linear lines. I mean, I'm not like left or right or center. It doesn't even apply to me in the way I think. And so, people just need to escape this mental box that they've been trapped in. And that's really what I aim to do with my work.
Well, it really is a religious cult. It's a cult of the state. And
The state religion is how I often refer to it, the state
Yeah.
religion. And this is part of the thing, that we're indoctrinated from early childhood into the state religion. Where, what I mean by that is this belief, this religious-like, cult-like faith that the government is good. It's this benevolent force, and we need the government to take care of us, and we need the government to be intervening in every aspect of our lives. And so there are so many people who really fervently believe that as a matter of faith, because they've been so deeply indoctrinated into that state religion. And so we need to free people from that mental slavery.
Amen. That is a fact. And that actually is, I think, maybe a good segue into, because again, I do think you're doing wonderful work, and I really appreciate the books and the articles that you put out. By the way, go to jeremyrhammond.com. There's always really insightful, well documented, and very, very important work that you do. And then you have this new book, A Brief History of Palestine, which I think is, first of all, you're very generous. I know you're giving it away for people on your website right now currently. I think it's an important book. What kind of inspired you? Why did you feel like this was a book that you needed to put out there?
Two major factors kind of led to me just producing this. So back in October, of course, we had the Hamas terrorist attack in Israel on October 7th. And shortly after that, Walter Block and Alan Futterman, two self-described libertarians, published an article in the Wall Street Journal arguing that Israel has a right and a moral duty to do, quote, whatever it takes to eliminate Hamas. And so Tom Woods, the popular Tom Woods show, another prominent libertarian, invited me to debate that proposition. I ended up debating Alan Futterman, Block's co-author on that article in the Wall Street Journal. And so, that kind of led me to, just, I had that debate. And then after that, I was invited to a bigger debate at the Soho Forum. And that was it was scheduled for February 26th. So I had, several months to prepare for the Soho debate in New York City. And so I got in the process of preparing for that debate. I had to refresh my memory on history of, of the Israel-Palestine conflict, because it had been several years since I really focused on it. Even pre-pandemic, I had already shifted the focus of my work almost entirely away from foreign policy matters to vaccines and public vaccine policy and the systematic violation of individuals' right to informed consent. So it had been a number of years since I had really even, spent any focus on Israel-Palestine whatsoever. I had kind of got to a point where I felt like, everything I've had to say about it It's an obstacle of peace. People can read that book. I don't really have much else to say right now about it. And so I was just focused on this other issues. And then, of course, the pandemic hit and COVID-19, the lockdown madness with its mass vaccination, coerced mass vaccination endgame. So that was just 100% my focus of just fighting this medical tyranny, this authoritarianism. And so it wasn't until October 7th and Israel's response of indiscriminately bombing Gaza and blocking food, water, fuel, shutting off the electricity, denying the Gazans things that they need to survive. That suddenly my focus was back on that issue, and so there was that. And then at the same time, in my networks, I was speaking out against Israel's genocide in Gaza, and just kind of within the health freedom community, for example. There was a lot of people like supportive of what Israel was doing. And so I was kind of butting heads with people. And I kept running into the same arguments over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
God gave the land to the Jews.
Right.
The name Palestine, the land was named Palestine by the Romans after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Jewish revolt, as an act of retribution to humiliate the Jews by renaming Judea after the Philistines.
Right.
So these types of claims. The Arabs only recently came to the land. There was no Palestine. There never was a place called Palestine. The Palestinians are a recently invented people. You keep hearing all of these types of arguments. And so it was kind of those two factors. Number one, I was trying to prepare for this debate. And so I was trying to refresh my memory on, because I had mostly focused on my past research on like the Mandate era through the present. And so to prepare for the debate, I kind of got into the thinking that I need to kind of go back. I want to go back to like ancient history. And I want to understand that the history of Palestine from like Canaan up through the Mandate era, right? And so it was kind of a new line of research for me. I'd never really studied that like as a major focus. At the same time, also, just wanting to address these claims that people kept making, essentially trying to deny the Palestinians' connection to the land.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what eventually led. I just eventually compiled all that research that I was doing for those two purposes into an article that I published at the beginning of this year. And then just this month, I kind of revised that article and kind of updated it and made some corrections and things, and expanded it a little bit and published it as this ebook. And also it's available as an audiobook. And so if you just go to jeremyrhammond.com and you'll see in the navigation, there's a link for a free ebook. Or if you sign up for my you'll see the sign up forms on my articles and things offering the free ebook. So you can just sign up and I'll send you the links to download the ebook editions and the audiobook versions. And there's 5 different file formats, so you can kind of enjoy it in whatever way you please. And so I'm giving that away free. And, really the aim of the book is to dispel popular Zionist myths that aim to deny the Palestinians' ancient historical connection to the land. Yeah, because they do have an ancient historical connection to the land.
I think I think my personal journey, I don't know if it's the same. I don't know how unique it is, but I think I certainly would have called myself pro-Israel, even pro-Zionist for most of my adult life, not understanding. I mean, obviously, having learned what I've learned through what I learned, you only know what you know. And it really was, while I'd started questioning things, I had read, a little bit of, what is it? What is his book? Scott Horton. I've read some of his articles and I've read some of his books, and it really started to kind of make me think differently. And honestly, Jeremy, because I remember I think 1 or 2 days after I saw that debate you had on the Talmud, contacting you for the first time, because it really changed my. I mean, I'm saying that I think this might be the first time I'm telling you this, but it really was a big factor in changing my mind, because I
Oh,
realized in watching that debate, um, the facts were really on the side of the Palestinians, and the emotion and there really was not good logical arguments that I mean, every argument that the Zionists were putting out there, you were just handling with straight facts and logic, and I had to look into it more, and that's really what intrigued me, to look deeply. I think that, and the factor of the whole October 7th thing made no sense to me. So I think those two things combined kind of collaborated and conspired to help me come to what I believe right now, which I think is it's absolutely, it's the opposite and the reverse 100% of what we've been taught and what we think. And I think that's why your book is so valuable. It's a short book, but it is incredibly valuable, because if you look at it with any kind of open mind, I think it will. I think it'll act, if not change your mind, I think it'll make you think differently about what you've been taught for your whole life.
yeah, and
Um,
aim to keep it short. A lot of my content is very long form. I've
right.
got articles published on my website that are longer than this book. But yeah, I wanted to keep it as I explained in the introduction, as brief as reasonably possible. To explain
Yeah.
this long history. From ancient times
Well, and I
to
think that's
the
valuable
man-made
because
era.
Dave Smith, all often, talks about, and I can't remember now, of long form podcast, which is wonderful. I've listened to the whole thing. I think it's 18 hours of the history, which is again, it's amazing.
Yeah.
But to have something compact, and to have not to have that much of a to be able to quickly digest this stuff, and do it quickly. I want to address one of the things that you brought up, and it is a major focus of your book, and is that argument of an ancient Israel, and a right, their right to the land, because of that God had given them that land. I don't think it's a good argument, but I think it may be the most logical, the most compelling argument, especially to Christians. I think it's the reason why many Christians would call themselves Zionists and support the Israel cause, and you just absolutely smash those ideas. Talk a little bit about that argument, and the actual history of it.
Sure. Well, to begin, I don't accept religious arguments. I think we need to look at this as a matter of history and fact
Mm-hmm.
and logic and reason, not as a matter of faith. Um, but that said, let's look at that argument. What Christians believe. You hear all the time that God gave the land to the Jews. I was raised in a Christian environment. I was raised in a Christian family, and you when you're raised in that environment, you hear all the time people saying things like, we must support Israel no matter what. This is
Right.
just like a
Well,
religious belief.
yeah, and even, I mean, even the Zionists themselves, what's their claim to the land? And they'd hold up the Bible, they'd hold up, the Hebrew Bible, saying this is our document, this is what gives us our right.
Right. And it's puzzling to me because um, at one point in my life, I actually decided to just sit down and read the Bible from cover to cover. And I actually did that a number of times. And I really made a study of the Bible. Um, and it kind of blew my mind about, because when you're growing up and you go to school, like you go to Sunday school or you go to church, listen to the sermons, and they always pick out these passages, and then they have like an hour long sermon about like this one or two little passages, and so it's just like you get these little glimpses of what's in the Bible. But when you actually like read it from cover to cover, you kind of realize like, oh my gosh, like so much is taken completely out of context, and so much of what you're taught to believe is just like completely like when you read it for yourself and you can think about it for yourself and draw your own conclusions and you have your own interpretation, and you just see how everything is completely misinterpreted. And so that really, that act of just reading it from cover to cover really kind of freed my mind from kind of the indoctrination that I had been, from what the beliefs that I had been indoctrinated into. And so that was a really good experience for me. And so one of the things that like really blows my mind, and as I said, is just really puzzling to me, is how so many Christians can miss the central theme of the Old Testament, which is the Hebrew Tanakh, which Christians refer to as the Old Testament, which is that so you have the story of Abraham of Ur in Mesopotamia being told to travel to the land of Canaan, and God promises that Abraham is going to be the father of many nations, and that he's going to give that land to his descendants. And then, of course, you have the story of the slavery in Egypt, and Moses, leading the Israelites out of Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea. They end up in the Sinai Desert. He ascends Mount Sinai and comes back with the 10 Commandments. And so there's this covenant that the deal is, the Hebrews are to be God's chosen people, and in return for their obedience and their honoring of the covenant, they would be considered a holy people, and he would give them the land. But that came with this warning but if you violate my covenant, and if you persist in your sinful ways, the land will vomit you out. And so you have this history in the Bible. And so then there's this, so in the Bible, there's a story of this united kingdom of David and Solomon, which was then divided into the northern kingdom of Israel, where 10 of the Hebrew tribes lived, and then the southern kingdom of Judah, which is where the tribe of Judah and Benjamin lived. And you had the northern kingdom was dissolved when it was invaded by the Assyrian Empire. And so they were in Hebrews were captured and taken away, the Assyrian exile. And in the Bible, it describes that as a warning to Judah, which persisted for another couple hundred years, I think. The kingdom of Judea, as it also is called. And God warns, in the prophets in the Bible, that God warns the people of Judah and Benjamin, those two tribes, look at what Israel, the other 10 tribes were doing. They persisted in their sins. And so this is just retribution for their violation of the covenant. And so it was a warning to the tribe of Judah. And then what happened? Did they honor the covenant? No, they persisted in their sinful ways. I mean, this is like the central story of the entire Old Testament. It's really hard to miss. And so what happened? Well, the Babylonians came in, and there was the Babylonian exile. And what does the Bible say about that? Well, you didn't learn the lesson from when I gave your sister kingdom a certificate of divorce. God describes it, a certificate of divorce. And you didn't learn the lesson, and you persisted in your sinful ways, and so you violated the covenant. Deal's off. And it's just like, it's astonishing to me how Christians use this argument that when European Jews immigrated into Palestine and took over the land, it was because and expelled Palestinians living there, that they had a right to do that because God had given them the land. Well, you look at the view of Orthodox Jews at the time. They were by and large opposed to Zionism. Why? Because they viewed the Zionist movement, which is a secular political movement, they viewed it as heretical. Because according to their interpretation of the Hebrew Tanakh, which is the same as the Old Testament, the Christian Old Testament, the diaspora, the exile of Jews from that land, is divine retribution for their sinful ways and for their violation of the covenant. And so they interpret the Old Testament. They say, well, we have to await the coming of the Messiah. And it's the Messiah who's going to lead us back to the land.
And by the way, if you think, oh, well, Jesus was a Jew, so he came to, maybe, redeem the Jews and their land. Well, if you actually read what Jesus said, I mean, there's this wonderful passage on the Sermon on the Mount where he talks about, your salt has lost its savor. It's trod out and good for nothing. I mean, salt was the token of a covenant. And so he's literally saying that's your salt is bad. It's over. Yeah. I mean, I came as a Jew, but I came to redeem the world. This is a
Right. Which is
completely,
why the Christians call it the New Testament. It's the
that's
New
right.
Covenant.
That's right. That's
And so it's
precisely
just
right.
like there's this cognitive dissonance among Christians, like they don't. So on one
And
hand, they have this, yeah,
yeah, and I was gonna say, and I think your point, like one of the problems with this, with how we think about this, is that we say Jews, and there's really two definitions of a Jew.
right,
There's the Jew who, there's the people that we call Jews, and then there's the religion that is the Jewish religion, and those are two completely separate things. And
right.
to say that the ancient Israels are the people that came, as you say, from Europe in the 20th century is kind of insane. Like
Yeah,
even lots
it is right. There's this idea of this collectivist idea of ownership, where the
right,
land belongs to the Jews. Well, you know, there's really something perverse about the fact that a European Jew who converted to Judaism and has no ancestral connection to Palestine whatsoever can
yeah,
immigrate
that
to
holds a
Israel
claim.
and become a citizen and own land there, whereas an Arab Palestinian is so perverse. It's just such a perverse idea of land ownership. So we have to reject these kind of collectivist ideas of land ownership. DNA is not a basis for property rights.
Right,
Religious beliefs are not a basis for property rights. There's individual rights belong to individuals, and so we have to look at individual property rights. And and that brings us that brings us into the mandate era, where by the end of the mandate, Jews had only managed to purchase about 7% of the land in Palestine, and Arabs owned more land in every single district. And also remained the majority. And so this idea that the land belonged to the Jews is perverse and absurd. It's a logical absurdity. And so yeah, as you pointed out, so the word Jew comes from the name of the tribe of Judah. So not all Israelites were Jews,
mm-hmm. Yeah,
right? You had other tribes, and so that's one point to make. And then also because people can convert, and so that there's conflicting genetic. One of the things that I did in my research, not only going back and look at the history and looking at like archaeological discoveries and things, and what does archaeology have to say about the biblical story, things like that. But it's also looking at like genetic studies, and read quite a number of genetic studies, which there's some conflicting information in there. So some are some look at Ashkenazi Jews, like European Jews, and say that they're directly descended from the ancient Israelites, and others say no, there's like just kind of like this, they really don't have ties. They were converts to Judaism by and large.
and
And
I think it's important to remember, for those biblically astute, to remember that those 10 tribes were scattered. So I mean, it's not like
right,
So anyway, sorry to continue, please.
yeah. And so the way to reconcile those two kind of, sometimes there's conflicting findings in the DNA studies, and the way that those are reconciled is that yes, by and large, Ashkenazi Jews do have, they are descended from ancient inhabitants of the Levant, that area of the Middle East. When you look along paternal lines, that connection remains quite strong
Right.
genetically. It's when you look along maternal lines, it's there's less of a connection. And so, what this is explained by wives, in marriages, that wives are converting to their husband's religion. So there's a lot of conversion to Judaism along
Mm,
maternal lines. And so this is how the conflicting data is reconciled,
right.
which is important because, on one hand, you have sometimes people claim that, Ashkenazi Jews aren't descended from the ancient Israelites at all. And, there's this argument of the Khazar, that the Khazars in Europe had converted to Judaism en masse. And, you have arguments like that essentially seek to deny, the ancestral claim, like, entirely. On the other hand, you have people, again, arguing that, anyone who describes himself as a Jew, regardless of their actual genetic ancestry, has this claim to the land in Palestine. So you have these two extremist positions, and really, that the truth is that yes, the Ashkenazi Jews are descended from ancient Israelites, but there has been a lot of conversion along the way. And so there are a lot of European Jews who really don't have an ancient historical connection to the land, in terms of genetics and their ancestry.
Which is why,
Um,
as you say, it's so important that we again separate, the idea that property rights have anything to do with DNA, have anything to do with religion. That it's important that
right.
property rights
Yes.
are the good in and of itself, right?
Right. And there's a number of other points to make there about the genetic studies. So the other major point, or one of the other major points, is that, according to the biblical narrative, the Israelites were foreigners to Canaan. Abraham came from Mesopotamia, and and when the Israelites entered Canaan, they were foreigners. And so you have the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and then you also, after that, after wandering in the desert for 40 years, you have the story of the Israelite violent conquest of Canaan,
Right.
which included through the genocide of some of the local tribes. But there's no archaeological evidence for either of those narratives. There's no evidence for the Exodus from Egypt, and there's no evidence that Canaan was violently conquered by the Israelites. And not, so that's looking at archaeology. But again, coming back to the genetic studies show that the Israelites were not foreigners in Canaan. So the Jews today are descended from Canaanites, as
Okay.
are Palestinians. So there are three groups of people who are the most closely related to Jewish groups, and those are the Palestinians, the Bedouin, and the Druze. They all
Okay.
shared a common ancestry. They're all descended from Canaanites. And so the Palestinians are descended from people who were living in that land before there was ever a kingdom of Israel or a kingdom of Judah, which, I think that's
Pretty wild.
profound.
Yeah, that's pretty wild.
Because if their whole claim, if the Jews' claim to the land is that they came into the land and they were given that land by God, and so
And they
because
wiped
of
out
their,
every man, woman, and child to obtain it.
yeah, right, yeah, the genocide then,
Well,
but
in other words, there's no DNA from you can't make the argument that they came in and then they married into this people because they killed them all according to their according to the history or the story.
well, so yeah, and the point that I want to make here is that today you have people arguing that, well, the Palestinians, Arabs were recently migrated into Palestine in recent history. So, they don't have an ancient historical connection to the land. That's the claim, but the Jews do, because there was once an ancient kingdom of Israel.
But if
Well,
that's
okay, but let's take that argument and let's correct it. Well, actually, the Palestinians were there first. If you accept that the Israelites were foreigners to Canaan, if you accept that biblical narrative, guess what? The Palestinians were there first because the Palestinians are descended from Canaanite tribes. So there goes that argument.
yep.
But or you can accept the genetic evidence that actually the Israelites were not foreigners to that tribe, which kind of gives them back that ancient historical connection, that claim, because they were there too. They're also descended from Canaanites. So we can give them that back. But you can't have it both ways. You can't have this argument that, oh well, the land belonged to the Jews because it was once a kingdom of Israel. And the other point is, that era has been ruled by many different peoples over the ages. And so who's to say that other peoples still in existence today don't have a greater claim to that land? I mean, it's really, again, it's just this collectivist idea of land ownership is
It's
absurd,
it's
and it
100%.
needs to be discarded.
Absolutely. And we've just discussed this many times on the show before, but I just want to reemphasize, like, just because a land is ruled by a certain people, this is again why governments, as I said before, muddy the waters. Just because it's ruled by the land doesn't mean that that person's farm belongs to somebody else or to the government, or can be, um, excised just because a claim. Although that happens all the time, we cannot say that that's right or just. That land, those people it belongs to them. And if you want to go and peacefully and buy land, and if you want to do things like that, like there's no problem with that. But the second you say, no, I know you've lived here for generations and you farmed this land, and this is where your people are from. But I'm gonna take some crazy Ottoman's deed or some story that comes from the Bible, and I'm just going to take this over and say that this is now my land. I mean, you can say, okay, might makes right, but it does not make it just.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that I have more Scottish ancestry than any other, any
Exactly.
other, past genetic history, I'm more Scottish than anything else. It doesn't mean that I can go to Scotland and say, oh, hey, well, I own land here because I'm mostly Scottish, well, that's not how it works. That's not
By the
how
way, I
property
didn't know
rights
that
work.
your family's from Scotland.
I'm probably about close to half Scottish. I think
Okay.
if you go back, like my maternal grandmother on my dad's side was Scottish. She was first generation in the U.S. from Scotland. And
Okay.
I've got other grandparents had Scottish blood. So yeah, I'm more and I'm kind of a mix of different European
Sure.
Caucasian
You're right. You're an
cultures,
American.
but more Scottish than anything else. And just in terms of my ancestry.
I've done a
So I've
couple
got
of
some
episodes.
Neanderthal in me.
Right, right. I've done a couple of episodes with Murray Pittock, who's probably the foremost Scotland scholar. I mean, he's amazing, and I'm fast. It's funny. I have some Scottish in me, but I'm writing a musical right now about one of the great American heroes that came from Scotland, named Hugh Mercer, and and so I'm yeah, when I hear Scotland or I'm from Scotland, I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. That's, you know, I I have a claim on his heritage because I'm writing a musical.
Yeah, great.
Anyway, but anyway, I apologize for the diversion. But no, I think your point is exactly right. Like, just because um, you know, I have some percentage of some land in Germany or England or anywhere, doesn't give me a right to go and take somebody's house. It
Right.
just
Yeah.
does.
Exactly. Yeah. Which is, of course, another one of the myths. There's so much so many Zionist myths, these propaganda claims that are specifically intended to deny the Palestinians connection to the land. So, one hoax claim is that, the land was uninhabited, which people still believe to this day. Never mind the documentary record. They just believe that, the land was what was the phrase used at the time, a land without a people for a people without a land.
Right.
Completely untrue. The Arabs were living there. There
Well,
wasn't
in the
that,
U.S.,
there's this claim.
I was going to say, Jen, and the U.S. knew going into it that, or were warned that if they supported this, that they would be entangled in that area forever because of that very thing, that there's so many people there that have a rightful claim to what the Zionists
Right.
wanted
And
to do.
the British who occupied Palestine after World War I under the League of Nations mandate, um, they had gained support for their war effort from the Arabs by promising to support their independence from Ottoman rule. And so you had Arabs, including Palestinians, fighting on the side of the British because of this promise that, oh, well, we can gain our independence as a result of this. And of course, Britain completely reneged on that promise. But you have claims like that. The Arabs only mass migrated into Palestine after the arrival of the European Jews, after Jewish immigrants arrived and made the desert bloom. And so the Arabs mass migrated there to take advantage of the economic development from the Jews. And it's just all this nonsense, like these like outright hoax claims that people have like really convinced themselves. But another one is, this claim that, again, trying to deny the Palestinians' ancient historical connection, that, the name Palestine was
Right.
created by the Romans as, from is some derivative of the name, from Philistia, right, for the Philistines. So to name the land after the ancient Israelites' enemies, to humiliate the Jews after the Jewish revolt. But this is completely untrue. The land had been called Palestine long before the Romans ruled that area. The Greeks had called it Palestine for hundreds of years before the Romans. And, so the word Palestine really comes from the ancient name for the land. The ancient Egyptian text referred to Paliset. And in Assyrian, it was called Palishtu or something like that. And so you have these ancient names for that land. And so over the years, it's been ruled by different peoples, that name has evolved. But, that's the origin of the name of Palestine. And so, this claim that it was just this invention of the Romans to humiliate the Jews, again, the whole purpose of this false claim is to deny the Palestinians' ancient historical connection to the land. You hear this claim that there was never such a place as Palestine, like, before the Mandate, that no
Well,
such place as Palestine existed.
there's never such a
And it's
place
true; it
called
was never an
Israel
independent.
either. There's never
Well,
such
and
a
there's
place called Israel until
yeah,
1940.
and there was a kingdom of Israel. We do know that there was, but there's dispute about the extent of it. About
Right.
there's the biblical description of it as, so the United Kingdom of David and Solomon may have never existed. And there's Israeli archaeologists who make that argument that if it did exist, it was really just a small kingdom. It wasn't like this big regional power. Jerusalem was essentially a village.
Right.
And there was a kingdom of Israel. But, I'm speaking specifically about like this idea of this united kingdom under Kings David and Solomon. So there's, Israeli archaeologists who dispute that entire biblical narrative. And yeah, and so the point being, in terms of the name Palestine, it's true that Palestine never existed as an independent state, but that's been the name that, the popular name for that region literally since before the kingdom of Israel and Judah ever existed.
Right. Well, I mean, and even like we could think of other examples. Even like, for example, now we say Ukraine. Well, growing up, I used to call it the Ukraine. It was a
Yeah,
landmass
the
within the
Ukraine.
Soviet
Yeah,
Union. And we see that
right.
all the time. It doesn't take away any kind of claim or non-claim. I mean, it doesn't matter, but it does. I mean, I will say I understand people have those arguments, so it's important to talk about and dispel those arguments. I mean, I think it's very important. But man, they don't make any sense to me. Just because I don't understand why. Just because it wasn't called a certain thing doesn't mean, just because. Just because it wasn't called Palestine doesn't, so does that mean there was no such thing as a Palestinian, or that person
Right.
is an
Yeah.
illegitimate
That-
person, or I
yeah,
don't
that's the
know what that
logical.
means.
Right, exactly. Yeah, what is the argument? But it's like that's what they're trying to imply. Like, right, Palestine didn't exist, so therefore there couldn't have been any Palestinian people, right?
Right.
This is the argument, which of course is ridiculous. It's just nonsense. The Palestinians are a people. They were a people. Palestine had existed. And of course, it's true that Palestine never existed as an independent state. It was before the Mandate era, before the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire as a result of World War I. The Ottomans had a different official name for that area. It was actually a number of different districts. But looking at like European culture, looking at the way it was referred to by Europeans, they called it Palestine.
Right.
Shakespeare referred to Palestine in two of his plays.
Well, I can't remember if you mentioned in your book, but I think aren't there maps that go back, long, long ago that Palestine, I mean,
Sure.
ancient maps.
Yeah. The cover the cover image I chose for the ebook
Yeah.
is from 1894, I believe. And it's a map showing ancient. Yeah. Oh, great. Perfect. Nice. It's a map showing ancient. It's a map of the region at the time of the Israelite tribes, right? It's showing where all the Israelite tribes are. But in the lower right corner of the map, it's labeled Palestine. So I thought it was just like the perfect image. So it's on one hand, it's showing that region at the time when it was, inhabited by the Israelites, and the irony of it being labeled Palestine. And of course, this is before, this is at a time when we're supposed to think that there was no such place as Palestine. But there it is. That's on the map from that time, right? From like the pre-mandate era. Like, this is pre-mandate. So when I found that map, I thought that, well, that's perfect.
Oh, it's a great image. It really is. Yeah, and then I think also a common myth or argument is that you talked about that, not just that the people came after that the Muslims and such, the Arabs came after the Jews came, but also that it was actually it was the Muslims that conquered the land. That you talk about that argument and how you dispel it.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons people think that the Palestinians only arrived in that area in relatively recent history, is because you had the Muslim conquest of that land. But people are not distinguishing between Muslims and Arabs. There were Arabs long before there were ever any Muslims. So, Islam is a religion. So, but long before this religion existed, there were Arabs.
Well, I think there's also
they were living in that region.
That when and I don't know where we get this idea, but like when you conquer a land, that somehow like it's all like the point of conquering the land, people think is just to wipe everybody out. When the truth is, to conquer the land is to have power over the people that are already there. And so it's not like there's different people there. It's the same people. They may convert, they may change, they may have different ideas, but it's the same people.
Well, it was under the Muslim rule that Jerusalem came to have a Jewish population again, because there was there was a mass depopulation of Judea under the Romans as a result of the Jewish revolts, and they were violently repressed. And so there was this mass depopulation, both through extermination and through flight. Not all Jews left the region. There was a persistent Jewish population, like in the area of Galilee. But certainly around the area of Jerusalem, there was essentially this expulsion, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And so, there was this, kind of depopulation, but it was under the Muslim rule that Jews returned, and this Jewish population returned to Jerusalem. And so, that's one aspect of it.
What is, can you describe like what the state of things were before, say, the late 19th century, in that part of the region? Like, was it relatively peaceful? What were the people like, before the Zionists came? What was it like to live in Palestine?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So, yeah, I mean, this was one of the things that came up in my debate with Alan Futterman back in October on Tom's show. Essentially, they have this argument that, and they made the same argument in this paper that I had debated one of their co-authors, Rafi Farber, years prior on Tom Wood's show as well. Another, co-author of Walter Block's. So because they have written a paper, they've written a book, and they have this argument that the root cause of the conflict was inherent Arab anti-Semitism. The Arabs just couldn't stand the idea of Jews living in that area, and owning land in that area, and then having a state of their own. And I just go on, I just debunk this total nonsense, because you can look at their own claims and even their own sources, and you can debunk that claim. They're looking at the paper that they had published, quite a few years back. You look at their own sources. So they cite British sources, for example, because there was after, and they look at these acts of violence in 1920, 1921, the Hebron massacre in 1929. They point to these acts of, these Arab riots in which Jews were murdered. And that's their evidence that, the Arabs, the Palestinians, just pure anti-Semitism. They just hated Jews. Well, but you can go back and look at the British commissions of inquiry into each of those outbreaks of violence, and the purpose of which inquiries were to determine what was the cause of these outbreaks of violence. And in each case, they determined that there is no inherent Arab anti-Semitism. That the problem was that the Arabs were simply becoming increasingly aware of how the Zionists aimed to dispossess and subject them, which was true. And the Zionists were open about that with the British. They were open, and the British said that the Zionist leadership is completely open about their intentions.
Right. Yep.
And so the Arabs were like kind of figuring out what the Zionists were up to with the help of the British, because the whole purpose of the British belligerent occupation of Palestine was to deny the inhabitants their right to self-determination, in furtherance of the Zionists' aim to reconstitute Palestine into a demographically Jewish state.
And it wasn't because the Britons were doing Jews a favor. The fact is, they wanted as many of the Jews out of their own country. I mean, they were happy to, and I don't say that with pride or good. I mean, the anti-Semitism was definitely on the side of the Europeans, that they wanted to.
Yeah. That was one of the three big factors. It was European anti-Semitism, and this a really stark illustration of that came from the what was called the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry. So this joint British and American report that was put out, in which they made this comment that again, supportive of the Zionist project. And they made this comment about how, because Jews can go to Palestine and receive a welcome there, unlike other places. And so it was kind of like this implicit acknowledgement of their own policies of like, and this was post Holocaust. I'm speaking specifically, where European countries in the US as well kind of had this policy of not accepting all but, kind of like symbolic numbers of Jewish refugees of the Holocaust. So they were happy to see them go to Palestine. Why? There's just rampant anti-Semitism. The other two big reasons being, number one, British, the Balfour Declaration, 1917, the British wanted Jewish support for the war effort, and in that context, it's illuminating to point out that the Balfour Declaration was a letter from the British Foreign Minister, Lord Arthur Balfour, written to whom? To Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild, the prominent Jewish banker. So to get Jewish support for the war effort, including from the banking family. And also the second reason being, just for the British to establish a military foothold in that region, particularly with their sights set on, controlling the Suez Canal and protecting their interest in the Suez Canal. And so those were the three big reasons, getting Jewish support for the war effort, establishing a military foothold in the region, and anti-Semitism. So those were the three major reasons that the British supported the Zionist movement, regardless of the rights of the indigenous Arab population.
Well, and I will say they were absolutely right that in the beginning they were welcomed. It was not a hostile uh,
Yeah,
beginning.
that's correct.
It's only when the Arabs kind of got, wait, this is not going to go well for us. If we
Right.
continue to
That's
happen.
that's another important point that the British pointed out in their, again, they had these committees of inquiry into the causes of these outbreaks of violence in the 20s and the 1920s. And this is one of the things they pointed out is like it was that, before, under the Ottomans, Jews, Christian Arabs, Muslim Arabs, they all lived peacefully. They had relatively peaceful, harmonious relations
Right.
in Palestine. And it wasn't until the Zionist movement that you started seeing this resentment among the Arab population toward Jewish communities, because you had this mass Jewish immigration with the aim of dispossessing the indigenous Arab inhabitants. So of course that's going to create this resentment and this, so if there was hatred towards Jews, it wasn't anti-Semitism, it was anti-Zionism. And the British pointed this out,
Yeah.
because they did live peacefully together. And Palestine was, um, pre-mandate, it was a refuge for Jews, particularly, in comparison to the rampant anti-Semitism in Europe, because
Yeah.
Jews lived peacefully in Palestine.
There weren't pogroms in Palestine.
No,
No.
that's right.
And I think that's such an important point, because I think one of the arguments, again, and you mentioned this earlier, is that there's like almost this inherent, as you say, this inherent anti-Semitism among the Arab people, and that's just not true. People weren't shouting from the river to the sea, in 1860. That just wasn't happening. People in 1905, people weren't, you know, claiming that, or just absolutely mobbing, Jewish people. That was not what was happening. Well, and so I think that's an important myth that, and again, because it spills into today. People will say things like, "Oh, if the if if the Palestinians drop their weapons, there will be peace. If the Israel drops their weapons, there will be no Israel." Well, that's just patently false. And and you have to ask yourself, well, where does all this hatred come from? Because it's not inherent. It's not like it came with the curse of Cain or something. This is not how those people were. There are actual actions that have to be accounted for if there's ever going to be any kind of conflict resolution in that area.
Right. And, coming to the, looking at the kind of more recent history in the Mandate era, and my book goes up through the Mandate era. So it really is the pre-Israel history of Palestine. So another popular Zionist propaganda claim, another myth, is that, the 1948 war started when the neighboring Arab states, launched, declared war against the newly created state of Israel, which is ahistorical. It's just not true. Number one, for as a simple point of logic, it can't possibly be true, because no legally defined state of Israel existed. And so this ties into another grand myth that we've probably discussed before on previous shows, but just for your audience who might not have watched
My
previous
audience
shows.
is growing, so
So let's just cover that again. So there's this myth that that Israel was created by the UN, and this is a reference to UN General Assembly Resolution 181, which was the infamous Partition Plan resolution. But just a couple of quick points about that. Number one, General Assembly resolutions are non-binding. Security Council resolutions are binding on member states. General Assembly resolutions are more just expressions of the international will, the will of the international community, the consensus of the international community. They're reflections of, essentially, opinions of the international community. So they're non-binding. So the General Assembly had no legal authority to partition Palestine. What they did do was they adopted the partition plan recommendation and they referred it to the Security Council. It did go to the Security Council, and that's where it died. And the reason for that was because, as the U.S. representative at the time pointed out, the UN Security Council also does not have the authority to partition Palestine against the will of the majority of its inhabitants. So the partition plan was never implemented. And so you have on May 14th, 1948, which was the date of the expiration of the British mandate, the Zionist leadership unilaterally proclaimed the existence of the state of Israel without defining borders for their supposed state. And they cite Resolution 181 as though it granted legal authority for their proclamation. However, the other part of this is that Resolution 181 neither partitioned Palestine nor conferred any legal authority to the Zionist leadership for their unilateral declaration of May 14th. And so when they declared the state of Israel in Arab Palestine, so claiming sovereignty over land that was not theirs, by that time, this is what people don't get. They say that this war was started by the Arabs after that date, when the Arabs invaded. Once the state was proclaimed, once Israel was proclaimed, the neighboring Arab states invaded, and that resulted in this refugee problem of the Palestinians. No, by the time the neighboring Arab states militarily intervened into Palestine, there was already over 250,000 Palestinians who had been ethnically cleansed from their homes as a result of the Zionist military offenses. And you can read Israeli historian Benny Morris, preeminent Israeli historian, who's an ideological Zionist. Read his books. And he describes it. He describes it as pre-May, like from April, that the Zionists were engaged in what he described as a, quote, war of conquest. This was a month before the Arabs supposedly started that war. According to Israeli historian Benny Morris, no, the Zionists were engaged in a war of conquest to conquer Palestine through force of arms.
Okay, because I'm a musician, I like to push the thing forward. So tell me if I'm overstepping here. Could one make the argument that the current conflict, the current assault on Gaza right now, is a continuation of that war of conquest?
Yes. What we are seeing, I like to put it this way, that the thin veil has been lifted and the true face of modern political Zionism is revealed. And you can see Israeli politicians saying things like, but going back to October, saying this is going to be Nakba 2. Nakba being, al-Nakba being the Arabic, in Arabic it means the catastrophe, which is how the Palestinians refer to the ethnic cleansing of 1947 to 1949. It was the Nakba, it was the catastrophe when they were ethnically cleansed from their homes. 250,000. By the time the neighboring Arab states intervened, already 250,000. By the end of that war, by the time armistice agreements were reached, 750,000 Palestinians had been ethnically cleansed from their homes, never allowed to return. Over 500 Arab villages were literally wiped off the map so that they would have no homes to return to and to make way for Jewish settlements. This was how Israel was created. And so people have all kinds of delusional beliefs about how Israel was created. And the Zionist propaganda narratives aimed to try to cast sole blame on the Arabs. The Arabs just hated the Jews. The Arabs tried to wipe Israel off the map in this genocidal war of conquest just because they hated Jews so much. This completely whitewashes the actual history of the conflict, the true history of the conflict. And so people just need to be disabused of these Zionist propaganda narratives. And that's the aim of this book, kind of looking at the pre-Israel history, going back to ancient times.
Well, I do think,
and yes, what we're seeing with the genocide in Gaza is a continuation of the ideology and the mindset that led to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned, I mean, the fact that weeks before the October 7th attack, Netanyahu holds up a map at the UN of Palestine, and the entire thing is called Greater Israel on the map. I mean, it's so provocative. It's so it's clear that ideologically they see that entire land as theirs.
Yes.
They don't. They're the ones that don't see a two-state solution. They're the ones that don't recognize that that there can be a people in that region that aren't dominated by Zionist rule.
Right, and this gets more into the materials that are in my book, Obstacle to Peace. But the Palestinians accepted the two-state solution. It was always rejected by Israel. And so you have this propaganda claim, like trying to flip that reality around as well. And that we could discuss that perhaps too, but I think we've also covered that in prior shows.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Palestinians have accepted the two-state solution. It's the Israelis who have rejected it, and always. And the U.S. also rejects the two-state solution, notwithstanding the ostensible aim of the so-called peace process being to establish two states. But what Israel and the U.S. mean by a two-state solution is entirely different from the two-state solution, which is premised on the applicability. The two-state solution is premised on the applicability of international law, including the need to implement UN Security Council Resolution 242, which in the wake of the 1967 war, which was begun by Israel on the morning of June 5th with a surprise attack on Egypt that wiped out its air force while most of its planes were still on the ground. That Resolution 242 called on Israel to withdraw its forces from the occupied territories, which was the Syrian Golan Heights, the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, and the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So it called on Israel to withdraw in accordance with the principle of international law that the acquisition of territory by war is inadmissible. So that's the two-state solution. The two-state solution is Israel must withdraw back to the armistice lines. And the idea of the international community, the consensus view among the near consensus, Israel and the U.S. are an exception to this. The near consensus is that the two-state solution calls for withdrawal of Israeli forces from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and establishment of a Palestinian state along those 1967 lines with minor and mutually agreed revisions to that border. It's not a border now. They are still armistice lines, but that would be the goal, is to actually establish them as legally defined borders. And so, this is an interesting aspect as well, is back, and I discussed this in Obstacle to Peace, when the Palestinian Authority they had their UN bid to upgrade their status at the UN from an observer state to what's called a non-member observer. I'm sorry, not from an observer party. They weren't considered a state, to a non-member observer state. So a recognition of statehood by the UN, which succeeded in the General Assembly. And the U.S. was opposed to that. And one of the reasons was that one of the reasons they opposed that was because they said, well, Palestine has no legally defined borders.
Oh, that's rich.
Which, well, by the exact same measure, Israel has no legally defined borders. So it just is such a remarkable testament to the U.S. hypocrisy, that they would actually put forth this type of argument in opposition to the Palestinians' bid for recognition of statehood by the UN. To this day, Israel has no legally defined. Israel does not meet the definition of statehood under international law.
Which, by the way, and this is why I think your book, both your book Obstacle to Peace and this new book, is so vital. And I think this new book, maybe pound for pound, might be the most important, one of the best books somebody can read if they want a brief history of Palestine. I don't think there's anything quite like it, because the only way because we are living in the age of the American empire, the only way that this can change is for more and more Americans to understand the history and put pressure on their leaders. Because the only reason why Israel gets away with what they do is because of they got Big Brother just right behind them, backing them up. And it's important that if people understand that the arguments that they've been hearing their whole lives are nothing but bunk, are nothing but propaganda, and they understand and you are able, and I'm not saying that's an easy thing to do today, but if you're able to use your mind and your reason to open your head, open your mind to some of these ideas and some of these arguments, I think you will find that what has happened is insane, and it and you and like I feel again I'm a like a new convert to this. I'm full of zeal because I think it's important. I can't believe that it's so clear now. I can't believe that I went so long in my life, not understanding what was actually going on and really um, being willfully ignorant about the situation. And there are too many Americans that are willfully ignorant. And this simple little tiny book that you are have graciously given away at your website, I think is a great tool that can be used to help um, evangelize the people to the truth.
Yeah, great points here. Let me just reiterate some of the points you made there. So one of the problems, there's this view that people have that this conflict is just unsolvable. It's too complicated. There's too much hatred. It's just unsolvable. And I don't believe this. I really don't believe that. Maybe this is me being overly optimistic, but I believe that there is a path to peace, a path to a just peace. The problem is that what most people think that they know about the conflict just isn't true. And so it doesn't create the conditions for a peaceful resolution, because these myths and these deceptions and this propaganda perpetuate the status quo, and that's what needs to change. And as you pointed out, there is a path to peace, but step one is ending the U.S. policy, the long-standing U.S. policy of supporting Israel's crimes against the Palestinians. For that to happen, there needs to be a paradigm shift. The American people there needs to be an awakening to the understanding of the true nature of the conflict among the American population, which is what will be required for it to become politically infeasible for the U.S. government to continue that policy of supporting Israel's crimes against the Palestinians. So it really is up to us. There's no government in the world that's going to get this job done. If we want to see peace in the Middle East, that's up to us. And it requires putting in the effort to educate ourselves, to look objectively at the history, and to keep an open mind, and to really make an effort to understand the truth. But once you understand reality, like historical reality, once you see through the lies and the propaganda, to me, it really just illuminates the path forward. And it just becomes clear, like, okay, there is a path to peace and we can see it. It's just that you have to dispel all the nonsense and all the misinformation and the disinformation and the Zionist propaganda and the myths to be able to see it. But that is what's going to be required. And I do think that someday humankind will become civilized. I have hope that will be the case. And this is going to be necessary.
That's why we're doing what we're doing, right?
I'm on a civilizing mission, Mike.
That's right. Oh, I support you. This is good.
I appreciate that. Thanks, man.
Hey, you know what? I think we're gonna leave it there. I really truly want to encourage everybody, go to jeremyrhammond.com, pick up the free book. It's a PDF, audio version, multiple. I think you have a Kindle version that you can download, all for free.
Yep, there's an EPUB version for e-readers, also Kindle version as well. It's the PDF as well, and then which you can print out if you like. Also, there's 2 audiobook versions. So one is compatible with like Apple iTunes, and the other one is just MP3 audiobook. So I got all those versions, so you can kind of consume it however you like. Maybe read it while you listen to it. However, and I narrated it myself. Kind of my experiment for me, first time I ever did something like that. But I hope you'll go to jeremyrhammond.com and just sign up for my newsletters to get the download links and enjoy it.
Absolutely. So go check that out. And there's, again, there's a lot more there. Your work is, again, I think it's very good, very good. I go there often to get real informed and documented and some good writing. I have to say you're a good writer. So I appreciate that. So thank you, Jeremy. Thanks for coming on the show.
You bet, man. Anytime.
Mike is gone.
You are listening to And If Love Remains.
Gone but not forgotten.
First of 23 installments requested by Dr. Leavitt. Trying to be in compliance here because we're taking him and that whole organization down.
Speak peace like a Buddhist.